One man left his heirs 4,116 slaves, 3,600 pairs of oxen, and 60 million sesterces in cash. His funeral alone cost more than what most Romans earned in 200 lifetimes. Another owned estates worth 200 million sesterces, hundreds of buildings in Rome, and dozens of silver mines. These weren't kings. They were private citizens. But here's what they don't tell you. That wealth wasn't built on courage or honor. It was built on something far more powerful and far more dangerous. Rome didn't conquer the world with swords alone. It conquered it with debt, with financial systems so sophisticated, so ruthless, that they wouldn't be matched again for over 1,000 years. And when that system finally collapsed, it took the greatest empire in human history down with it. Welcome to History of Finance. Today, we're decoding the economic machine behind Rome, how it financed centuries of conquest, how the rich became unimaginably wealthy, and why the whole thing eventually came crashing down. Because the deeper you look, the clearer the pattern becomes, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. We like to imagine Roman legions as unstoppable warriors fueled by honor and discipline, polished helmets, sharpened swords, iron will. But behind every soldier was a supply chain of staggering complexity and cost. Thousands of men needed food, weapons, roads, and pay. Horses needed feed. Siege weapons needed timber and labor. And all of it required money, a lot of it. So how did Rome finance centuries of conquest? In the early Republic, Rome's military was a citizen army. If you owned land, you could be drafted. Soldiers brought their own weapons and expected to return to their farms after the campaign. But as the Republic expanded, wars became longer, further from home. The old model started breaking down. You couldn't just grab a spear and disappear for a year anymore. You needed professionals. That's when Rome began to centralize military financing. The state started paying stipends to its soldiers. Not much, but enough to keep them loyal. Then came the real pivot. Conquest itself became a revenue model. Every new province meant new taxes, new slaves, new gold mines, new tribute. It was a self-reinforcing loop. War funded more war. But here's where it gets dangerous. Rome didn't just rely on taxation. It relied heavily on borrowing. During expensive wars like the Punic Wars against Carthage, the Republic took out massive public loans from the wealthy elite, particularly the equites, Rome's rising financial class. These weren't patriotic donations. They were investments, and those investors expected returns, interest payments, tax farming rights, business monopolies in the newly conquered territories. So war became a business, and the more profitable it was, the more wars Rome started. Sound familiar? Over time, this militarized economy reshaped everything. Political power tilted toward generals who could promise spoils. Senators became shareholders in violence. Private contractors, the publicani, managed everything from logistics to tax collection, skimming fortunes off the top. It was a military-industrial capitalism in a toga. And the costs? They piled up. To pay soldiers and creditors, the state had to find new revenue constantly. When conquest slowed or uprisings drained the treasury, Rome resorted to the oldest trick in the book, debasing the currency. Starting under Emperor Nero, the silver content in the denarius was quietly reduced. Over the next 2 centuries, emperors kept diluting it, turning what was once a reliable silver coin into a thin promise backed by nothing. Inflation followed, confidence eroded, and by the 3rd century, Rome's monetary system was in free fall. But while the currency collapsed and the state borrowed itself into oblivion, Some Romans became obscenely rich, not through public service, but through the private sector. Elite Roman men were expected to devote their lives to public affairs. For many, whether on a city council or in the Senate itself, that was only their real career. And yes, especially in the late Republican era, when governors were more or less expected to plunder their provinces, public careers could be lucrative. But under the empire, despite large salaries paid to high officials, only a handful of imperial favorites grew truly rich through government alone. Most elite Romans made their fortunes in the private sphere. And although the great majority had inherited wealth, few were complacent. It was normal for a rich Roman to act like a modern investor, diversifying assets, seeking high-return investments, and managing risk. There were bankers in every substantial Roman city, but the elite tended to use them only for specialized transactions, like making payments at a distance. They usually preferred to keep their ready cash at home in iron safes. Wealthy families might have a few gold bars in their strongbox, along with piles of gold and silver coins. One first-century senator never left home without a wagon carrying gold worth 1,000,000 sesterces, but wealthy Romans kept only a small fraction of their wealth in cash. When they purchased a house or estate, they didn't pay with tens of thousands of coins. Instead, they performed transactions on paper, issuing promissory notes or exchanging debts and property titles. Like most pre-modern elites, rich Romans kept the majority of their wealth in property. The safest and most prestigious properties were country estates, normally worked by some combination of free tenants and slaves. The wealthiest Romans owned whole networks of estates scattered across the empire. Though not especially profitable, the typical annual return was something like 5 or 6%. Revenue from these properties added up. One poet mentions a man who earned 3,000,000 sesterces each year from his estates alone. Especially in the city of Rome itself, elite Romans also invested in urban real estate, baths, warehouses, and above all, apartment buildings. Crassus, one of the richest men in history, famously owned teams of slaves trained as firemen and builders. Whenever a tenement caught fire, he would rush to the scene, purchase the burning structure at a knockdown price, and then send his slaves in to extinguish the blaze and reconstruct the building. Even Cicero, who was only modestly wealthy for a senator, owned about 1,000,000 sesterces worth of rental properties in Rome. One investor made a lucrative career of buying houses, adding heated baths, and selling them for large profits. In addition to real estate, elite Romans invested heavily in slaves. Although their numbers were the greatest during the late Republic, there were millions of slaves in all periods, performing every conceivable job, from field laborer to imperial accountant. Crassus regarded slaves as the most valuable part of his property. Besides the thousands who worked his estates, he had hundreds trained to serve as readers, table servers, stewards, scribes, and silversmiths, and hired them out by the day. Other wealthy Romans trained slaves to serve as quasi-independent artisans, setting them up in shops with borrowed capital. These slaves were allowed to keep part of their earnings and could eventually buy their freedom. Even after they were free, they retained economic ties to their former masters, who might loan them money to invest in their businesses. Property, in the form of real estate, slaves, and other possessions, was the foundation of most wealthy Romans' fortunes, or at least that was what they wanted their peers to think. Trade was not regarded as a respectable occupation. Roman senators were actually prohibited by law from direct involvement in commerce. But since there were huge profits to be made, even senators found ways to take part. Cato the Elder, for example, set up an association of investors whose members financed ventures in overseas trade. The scale of such enterprises could be impressive, as could the profits. An Egyptian papyrus preserves part of a contract between an extremely wealthy Roman investor and a merchant sailing from Egypt to India. The merchant's profits from that single voyage were at least 7,000,000 sesterces.
equivalent to the value of a huge estate in central Italy. Some Romans also earned income from interest on loans. This was especially visible during the late Republic, when senators loaned money to provincial cities and foreign kings. Typically, however, wealthy Romans made their loans to individuals, often at the standard interest rate of 12%. Debt claims, written records of outstanding loans, made up an important part of most elite Romans' portfolios
and circulated almost as freely as cash, being transferred and sold. The philosopher Seneca, who happened to also be one of the empire's wealthiest men, reportedly held 40 million sesterces of debt claims in a single province. A few Roman magnates became, in effect, one-man banks, with agents working in the forum and even in the provinces. The portfolio of a wealthy Roman, in short, could be impressively diversified. Income streamed in from the revenues of estates, the rents of urban properties, the earnings of slaves, the profits of commercial enterprises, and the interest of loans, in combination perhaps with a government salary and legacies from well-placed friends. All this was usually more than enough to finance conspicuous consumption in the best aristocratic style. By the 1st and 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire was an economic powerhouse. At one point, the empire encompassed 20% of the global population. It vastly outperformed the rest of the world in technology, government organization, production, and military might. China was perhaps the only exception, having achieved significant technological advancements during this period as well. The standard of living that many Roman citizens enjoyed far outpaced other societies at the time, having an average income and access to public utilities and amenities that would not be matched again until the emergence of modern national economies in the 17th century. Recent studies have attempted to measure the size of the Roman economy at its demographic peak in the mid-2nd century. By combining multiple data sources and employing statistical methods, historians estimate Rome's GDP equivalent to roughly 50 to 90 billion US dollars in today's terms. That would place the Roman economy somewhere between the 66th and 94th most affluent nations today. Not bad for an ancient empire. But here's where it gets interesting. Only 5% of that GDP was captured and taxed by the central Roman state. The remaining 95% flowed through private markets. The early Roman economy was first and foremost based on agriculture and reliant on slavery. Around 90% of the population lived in the countryside, with the majority making their livings in farming or adjacent occupations. 10 to 20% of this rural population were slaves, either by birth, capture, or punishment, who were considered property. Roman slavery took on a much different form than our modern conception. It was what anthropologists call open slavery, meaning it was possible for a slave to be freed and, in doing so, fully accepted into society. Still, most Roman slaves were relegated to harsh lives of menial or strenuous work. Another key feature of the Roman economy was its broad, fairly advanced, and integrated market-based system. The vast majority of the economy functioned beyond the reach and scope of the central government. These markets operated organically, with typical supply and demand forces at play. They provided the necessary day-to-day business environment, and in this regard, they were truly the oil within the gears of the Roman economic machine. By the 1st and 2nd century AD, the empire was sufficiently integrated to allow for comparative advantages. Regions specialized in certain industries, contributing to increases in both efficiency and productivity. An explosion of trade during the first 2 centuries was a driving force behind Rome's economic growth, and the preponderance of this activity was based within the private sector. The early Roman Empire also had a fairly sophisticated banking and finance sector, along with a generally uniform currency. Romans often took part in loaning money to one another. Interest rates were usually 1% a month. Commercial banks existed that even issued mortgages. Unquestionably, the early Roman Empire was a hotbed of sophisticated financial activity. But beneath this prosperity, cracks were forming. The top 1.5% of households controlled 1/5 of Rome's total income,
A small middle class, about 5 to 12% of the population, made up another fifth. The remaining population, they lived close or slightly above subsistence level. About 90% of Romans were indigent, while the majority of excess income was consumed by the top 3%. The Gini coefficient, a measure of income inequality ranging from 0, perfectly equal, to 1, perfectly unequal, places the early Roman Empire between 0.42 and 0.44. That's almost directly in the middle of 13 other historic economies studied. For comparison, Britain in the early 19th century had a Gini coefficient of 0.59. Meanwhile, the rich got richer. Senators and equities shielded their wealth in land, slaves, and foreign accounts. The poor paid taxes in debased currency, while the elite secured tax exemptions and insider deals. Public services collapsed, corruption soared, and the financial burden of endless wars fell squarely on the lower classes through inflation, labor levies, and military conscription. This wasn't just a military collapse, it was a monetary one. But there's another reason Rome stagnated and eventually fell: creative destruction. In modern economies, new technologies constantly replace old ones. If a new technology is better, more desirable, or more cost-effective, it takes hold, resulting in productivity gains and sustained growth. But in Rome, creative destruction was actively stifled. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, he ended the majority of institutions of the Republic that had established broad representation. This sowed the seeds for Rome's eventual collapse, even if it took centuries to unravel. The decrease in accountability and distribution of power led to further increases in economic extraction by the political elite. Technologies that should have revolutionized the economy, like the water wheel, the rudder, or unbreakable glass, were either ignored or actively suppressed. According to Pliny the Elder, a man once demonstrated unbreakable glass to Emperor Tiberius, expecting a reward. Instead, Tiberius asked if anyone else knew the secret. When the man said no, Tiberius had him executed out of fear that the invention would devalue Rome's currency. Another inventor came to Emperor Vespasian with a device that could transport heavy columns with far less manpower. Vespasian dismissed it, asking, "How will it be possible for me to feed the populace?" In other words, he was worried about unemployment and political destabilization, even if the technology would have drastically increased productivity. When the political system became extractive, innovation stopped. And when innovation stopped, growth stopped. Rome hit a ceiling. And once it did, the whole system turned inward. The debt remained, the expectations remained, but the revenue dried up. That's when the state started squeezing its own people. Heavier taxation, more currency debasement, more control. Bread and circuses to keep the masses quiet while the elite fortified their villas. Sound familiar? Now pause and look around today. Governments running massive deficits, wars funded through borrowing, central banks quietly debasing currency to cover the shortfall. A financial class getting rich from defense contracts and crisis profiteering. An economy where expansion, military, monetary, or market-based, is the only way to keep the system afloat. It's not a perfect parallel, but the DNA is disturbingly familiar. What Rome teaches us is that an economy built on expansion, especially violent expansion, eventually hits a wall. You run out of lands to conquer, resources to extract, or enemies to fight. And when that happens, the entire system turns inward. Today, we don't call it tribute. We call it taxation, quantitative easing, or monetary policy. But the mechanics are eerily similar. Central banks print money. Governments spend more than they earn. The rich buy assets. The poor buy groceries with shrinking paychecks. Wars are still financed through borrowing. The U.S. spent over $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan, most of it funded by debt. Who gets the contracts? Who earns the interest? Who ends up footing the bill through inflation, reduced services, and unstable currencies? You already know the answer. And like in Rome, the cycle feeds itself. Once debt becomes your default, you don't need an emergency to print money. You just need to avoid collapse. You normalize the exceptional, and the longer it goes on, the more you have to pretend it's fine until it's not. That's what makes economic history so important. These aren't just dusty stories, they're warning signs. When we look at Rome, we see a state that outsourced too much power to private finance, became addicted to expansion, hollowed out its currency, and crushed its own citizens under the weight of unsustainable obligations. Not because it was evil, but because the system had no off switch. Today, we're living in a different empire, digital, global, and powered by capital flows instead of legions. But the game is still the same.
Money and power move together. War is still profitable. Inflation still punishes the weak. And financial illusions still work. Until they don't. So what can you do? Start by seeing the pattern. Because most people don't. Most people think inflation is random, that taxes are just necessary, that debt is freedom, that growth can go on forever. But history knows better. You can't opt out of the system entirely, but you can understand it. You can stop playing the game blindly. You can build your own resilience, not just with money, but with mindset. That means studying financial history, not just personal finance. That means watching for signs of systemic stress, not just market hype. That means asking, who profits when I stay confused? Because you weren't supposed to know this. You weren't supposed to ask how Rome paid for its wars, or how the modern state does it now. You were supposed to focus on the theater, the headlines, the GDP, the distractions. Not the mechanisms, not the incentives. But now you know. And once you know, you can't unsee it. Financial education isn't just about budgets and investing. It's about understanding power, understanding systems, and seeing through the illusion of stability. So next time you hear about a new conflict, a new stimulus, a new crisis, don't just watch. Follow the money. Ask who lends, who earns, and who pays in the end. Because if history teaches us anything, it's this. Empires don't fall when the enemy breaches the gate. They fall when the math stops working, and no one dares to fix it. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and here at History of Finance, we show you where to look.